The summer of 1876 brought an unprecedented announcement that rippled across the Texas frontier like wildfire through dry grass. Chief Thunderhorse of the southern Comanche had declared his intention to take a wife through a great gathering, open to women of all backgrounds who wished to join their lives with the most respected leader on the southern plains. The proclamation, delivered through interpreters at Fort Sill and published in newspapers from San Antonio to Denver, carried a simple message: come to the sacred grounds near the Red River on the harvest moon, and let character speak louder than convention. What Thunderhorse couldn't have anticipated was the overwhelming response to his unprecedented invitation. By late August, an enormous encampment had formed along the riverbanks, housing nearly 2,000 women who'd traveled from across the continent for this extraordinary opportunity. The gathering represented every corner of American society: refined ladies from Boston seeking adventure, desperate widows hoping for security, curious frontier women, Mexican señoritas, freed slaves from the South, and even a few European immigrants drawn by tales of the noble chief. The sight was unlike anything the American frontier had ever witnessed. Elaborate pavilions housing wealthy Eastern women stood alongside simple canvas shelters of farm wives and working women. Multiple languages filled the air as women from different backgrounds attempted to communicate, united only by their shared hope of capturing the heart of the legendary Comanche leader. "Chief," said Red Hawk, Thunderhorse's closest advisor and childhood friend, surveying the sprawling camp with undisguised amazement, "when you announced this gathering, I expected perhaps 100 women. This looks like all the women in America have come to our doorstep." Chief Thunderhorse stood on a bluff overlooking the massive encampment, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. At 34, he was considered the wisest and most powerful leader among the southern Comanche, a man who had successfully navigated the treacherous transition from the free-roaming life of his ancestors to the complex realities of reservation existence. His decision to seek a wife through this unconventional method had been born of practical necessity rather than romantic impulse. "The old ways of arranged marriages served our people when we lived by the old ways," he replied thoughtfully, his dark eyes taking in the vast sea of hopeful faces below. "But we live in a new world now, Red Hawk. Perhaps my wife should come from this new world we're all learning to navigate." The most remarkable aspect of the gathering was the elaborate competition that had emerged among the assembled women. Word had spread through the camp that Comanche men valued certain types of beauty and accomplishments, leading to an explosion of preparation rituals that transformed the riverbank into a showcase of competing displays designed to catch the chief's attention. Women who had never owned more than 2 dresses now sported elaborate costumes meant to suggest Indian princess fantasies. Trading posts for hundreds of miles had been cleaned out of feathers, beads, and colorful fabrics as the assembled hopefuls tried to outdo each other in creating eye-catching presentations. The more dramatic the appearance, the reasoning went, the more likely a woman was to stand out among such overwhelming competition. Elizabeth Hartford, daughter of a wealthy Philadelphia banker, had spent a fortune on an elaborate buckskin dress decorated with hundreds of imported beads and eagle feathers. "Chief Thunderhorse is said to appreciate women who honor his culture," she explained to her hired companion, while adjusting her elaborate headdress. "A woman must show proper respect for Indian traditions if she hopes to be chosen as his bride." Similar conversations echoed throughout the camp as women shared rumors, theories, and supposed insider knowledge about Comanche courtship customs. Most of these traditions were pure invention, created by imaginative minds trying to gain advantage in an unprecedented situation, but they spread through the gathering with the persistence of gospel truth. The economic impact of the gathering had transformed the entire region. Entrepreneurs had flocked to the area, establishing temporary businesses to serve the enormous crowd. Food vendors, clothing merchants, photographers, and even traveling entertainers had set up operations to capitalize on this unique historical moment. "I've been in the Army for 20 years, observed Colonel William Hayes from the nearby cavalry post, watching the controlled chaos through his field glasses, "and I've never seen anything to compare with this. It's like a county fair, a military encampment, and a religious revival all combined into one massive spectacle." But amid all the elaborate preparation and competitive display that dominated the gathering, one woman remained notably apart from the frenzied activity that consumed the rest of the camp. Chapter 2. The Woman Who Remained Apart. Margaret Maggie O'Brien sat quietly beside her weathered wagon at the very periphery of the great encampment, her presence so understated that most of the other women barely registered her existence. Unlike the colorful tents and elaborate displays that dominated the gathering, Maggie's simple canvas shelter and unadorned appearance marked her as either supremely confident in her natural appeal or completely oblivious to the fierce competition surrounding her. At 29, Maggie possessed the kind of quiet beauty that revealed itself gradually, deep blue eyes that held depths of experience, dark hair that caught auburn highlights in the sun, and a serene composure that suggested someone who had learned to find peace amid life's storms. Her simple grey dress, while clean and carefully mended, couldn't compete with the elaborate costumes and theatrical presentations that surrounded her, nor did she seem inclined to try. Maggie had been widowed for 4 years, ever since consumption claimed her husband Sean and their 2 young children during the brutal winter of 1872. The triple loss had nearly destroyed her, leaving her alone on a failing homestead in Kansas with debts she couldn't pay and relatives who made their disapproval of her Irish immigrant marriage painfully clear. She'd lost the farm to the bank 6 months ago, and this gathering represented her last chance at building a new life before accepting the charity of distant cousins who viewed her as a burden. "Honey, you can't seriously be planning to meet the chief looking like that," said Carmen Vasquez, a vivacious woman from San Antonio who'd positioned her tent nearby and appointed herself as Maggie's unofficial advisor. "Look around you. Every woman here is dressed up like she's attending a costume ball. You'll vanish into the background without something to make you stand out." Maggie looked up from the quilt she was mending, one of the few possessions she'd managed to save from the farm, her expression politely attentive but unchanged. "I appreciate your concern, Miss Vasquez, but I've never been comfortable with elaborate displays. If Chief Thunderhorse is looking for someone genuine, perhaps that's more likely to come from being myself, rather than trying to create a false impression." Carmen shook her head in exasperation, her own appearance dramatically enhanced with colorful ribbons, silver jewelry, and what she believed to be authentic Indian-style face paint. "Sister, there are 2,000 women here, most of them younger and prettier than either of us. This isn't the time for modesty. It's the time for making an unforgettable impression." But Maggie had already returned her attention to her needlework, effectively ending the conversation. She'd made the difficult journey from Kansas not out of romantic fantasy or desperate adventure-seeking, but from a carefully reasoned decision that her family still couldn't understand. Rather than accepting charity or entering into a loveless marriage with one of the local farmers who'd shown half-hearted interest in a penniless widow, she'd chosen to take control of her own destiny. The stories she'd heard about Chief Thunderhorse had genuinely intrigued her, not the romanticized tales of noble savages that filled popular literature, but the practical accounts from traders and government agents who described a man trying to lead his people through an impossible transition. The Comanche way of life was ending, whether they liked it or not, and their survival depended on leaders wise enough to navigate between preserving their identity and adapting to harsh new realities. Maggie understood something about impossible transitions. She'd spent 4 years managing grief, poverty, and social isolation while maintaining her dignity and her sanity. The experience had taught her that survival often required making difficult choices that others couldn't understand, and that strength sometimes looked like quiet endurance rather than dramatic gestures. "Mrs. O'Brien," called a respectful voice from beside her wagon, causing Maggie to look up in surprise. A young Comanche man approached with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to respect, though his mixture of traditional and white clothing reflected the cultural balancing act that defined life for his people. "I am Running Wolf, interpreter for Chief Thunderhorse," he said in careful but fluent English. "The chief has asked me to speak with some of the women before the formal presentations begin. Would you be willing to answer a few questions?" Maggie set aside her mending and stood, smoothing her simple skirt with unconscious grace. "Of course, Mr. Running Wolf, though I'm not sure what I could tell him that would be different from what the other ladies have shared." Running Wolf's observant eyes noted her unpainted face and unadorned hair with apparent interest. "The chief is curious about women who choose not to follow the crowd. He asks, 'Why did you come to this gathering? And what do you hope to find in marriage to a Comanche leader?'" The directness of the question surprised Maggie, but she appreciated the honesty behind it. Most of the women she'd overheard discussing the chief spoke in terms of romance and exotic adventure, as if marriage to him would be some kind of fairy tale rather than a partnership between two people facing complex challenges. "I came because I believe Chief Thunderhorse needs a partner who understands that building a life together requires more than passion or good intentions," Maggie replied thoughtfully. "The world is changing in ways that affect all of us, Indian and white alike. I think I could be useful in helping navigate those changes." "And what makes you believe you could be useful in such work?" Maggie considered the question seriously, aware that her answer would likely determine whether she ever had a chance to meet the chief himself. "I've spent the last 4 years learning how to survive loss and build something new from the pieces left behind. I understand that successful change requires honoring what came before while adapting to new circumstances. And I've learned that the strongest partnerships are built on mutual respect and shared commitment to something larger than individual desires." Running Wolf nodded slowly, his expression revealing nothing of what he thought about her response. "The chief will find your perspective interesting, Mrs. O'Brien. He has grown weary of women who see him as either a romantic fantasy or a solution to their personal problems." As the interpreter moved on to question other women, Maggie returned to her mending with a thoughtful expression. She'd made the journey to Texas with realistic expectations and practical goals, but something about Running Wolf's questions suggested that Chief Thunderhorse might be more complex and thoughtful than even she had anticipated. Around her, the great gathering continued its elaborate preparations, but Maggie remained focused on simply being herself, a decision that would soon prove more remarkable than all the costumes and performances in the entire encampment. Chapter 3. The Wisdom of Silence. The morning of the first formal presentation dawned with the clear, crisp air that marked the beginning of autumn on the Texas plains. Nearly 2,000 women stirred in their elaborate camps, each making final preparations for what many considered the most important day of their lives. The atmosphere hummed with nervous energy as last-minute adjustments were made to costumes, face paint was applied with artistic precision, and carefully rehearsed presentations were practiced one final time. Chief Thunderhorse sat with his council beneath the ancient cottonwood tree that had served as a meeting place for his people for generations beyond memory. The weight of choosing a life partner from such an overwhelming number of candidates pressed heavily on his broad shoulders, complicated by the knowledge that his decision would affect not just his personal happiness, but the future direction of his people's relationship with the rapidly changing world around them. "The tribal elders grow more concerned each day," Red Hawk observed quietly, gesturing toward a group of older Comanche men who watched the proceedings with thinly veiled disapproval. "They fear that choosing a white woman will encourage our young people to abandon the old ways entirely, and the Indian agent believes I should choose someone who will help our people assimilate more quickly into white society," Thunderhorse replied, his weathered hands clasped before him in contemplation. "Everyone has strong opinions about what my marriage should accomplish for others, but what about what it should accomplish for me as a man?" Running Wolf approached the council circle with news from his conversations throughout the vast encampment. Over the past 3 days, he had conducted informal interviews with dozens of women, following Thunderhorse's instructions to gauge their true motivations and character beyond the elaborate surface presentations they offered for public consumption. "Chief, I have completed the conversations you requested," Running Wolf reported. "The responses have been revealing. Many speak of love at first sight, though they have never met you. Others are refreshingly honest about seeking security and social position. A few demonstrate genuine interest in learning about our culture, though most have romantic notions rather than realistic understanding. And what of the quiet widow who refuses to join the spectacle? Margaret O'Brien, she is different, Chief. She speaks not of romance or adventure, but of partnership and practical cooperation. When I asked what she could offer, she didn't mention her appearance or domestic accomplishments. She talked about understanding loss, managing difficult transitions, and building something meaningful from whatever pieces remain after life changes everything." Thunderhorse's interest was clearly engaged. In a gathering dominated by women trying to transform themselves into what they believed he wanted, someone who remained steadfastly authentic represented a fascinating anomaly worthy of deeper consideration. The formal presentations began at noon, with women called forward in groups of 20, to introduce themselves before the assembled tribal council and growing crowd of curious spectators. The variety was staggering. Elegant ladies from eastern cities speaking in cultured tones about their accomplishments and connections, frontier women emphasizing their practical skills and understanding of hardship, and everything imaginable in between. Victoria Ashworth, daughter of a prominent Boston shipping merchant, glided forward in an elaborate dress that had cost more than most families earned in a year. Her costume attempted to blend European elegance with what she imagined to be Indian princess styling, featuring hundreds of feathers, beads, and silver ornaments. "Chief Thunderhorse," she announced in ringing tones designed to carry across the entire gathering, "I offer you a union that would bring substantial wealth and important political connections to benefit your people's future." Similar presentations followed throughout the long afternoon, each woman attempting to distinguish herself through increasingly elaborate displays of costume, talent, or promised advantage. Sarah Henderson demonstrated her exceptional horsemanship with riding tricks that drew admiring gasps from the crowd. Isabella Martinez performed traditional Spanish dances while singing in 3 languages. Catherine O'Sullivan recited dramatic poetry about the romance of frontier life and the noble savage. By late afternoon, the presentations had begun to blur together in Thunderhorse's mind, a kaleidoscope of painted faces, elaborate costumes, and carefully rehearsed performances that revealed surprisingly little about the actual character of the women involved. He found himself growing increasingly weary of the theatrical spectacle, wondering if his unconventional approach to finding a wife had instead created an impossible circus that obscured rather than revealed genuine compatibility. "Chief," Running Wolf murmured during a brief intermission between presentation groups, "the widow Margaret O'Brien is in the final group to be called. She still has not altered her appearance or prepared any special presentation." When Maggie's group was finally summoned forward, the contrast was immediately and dramatically apparent. 19 women arrayed in colorful splendor and elaborate costume stood alongside one woman in a simple gray dress whose only ornamentation was a small Celtic cross at her throat, a memento of her late husband. The other women in her group seemed to unconsciously distance themselves from Maggie, as if her plainness might somehow diminish their own carefully crafted presentations. "Mrs. Margaret O'Brien of Kansas," the tribal herald announced in both English and Comanche, and Maggie stepped forward with quiet dignity. She didn't curtsy or perform any special gestures. Instead, she looked directly at Chief Thunderhorse with steady blue eyes and spoke in a clear, calm voice that carried easily across the silent gathering. "Chief Thunderhorse, I'm honored to meet you. I've come not to perform or compete, but to offer you an honest partnership if you believe we might build something meaningful and lasting together." "Tell me," Thunderhorse said, speaking directly to her for the first time, and noting how her genuine composure contrasted with the nervous energy of most previous presentations, "why do you not paint your face and wear elaborate costume when all the others do?" Maggie's response was characteristically direct and thoughtful. "Because I don't know what your true preferences are, and I thought it would be dishonest to pretend to be something I'm not simply to win your approval. If you're looking for a genuine partner, shouldn't that partnership be based on authentic truth rather than theatrical performance?" A murmur rippled through the watching crowd, part surprise at her boldness in questioning the elaborate efforts others had made, part disapproval of what seemed like disrespect for the competitive spirit that had dominated the gathering. But Thunderhorse found himself genuinely intrigued by her refreshingly honest approach. "And what authentic truth do you offer me, Margaret O'Brien? I offer you someone who understands that marriage is daily work, not romantic fantasy. Someone who has learned to find practical solutions rather than simply hoping problems will disappear on their own. I cannot promise to be the most beautiful or entertaining woman here, but I can promise to be honest, loyal, and completely committed to whatever we might build together." As Maggie returned to her place among the other women, Thunderhorse felt something he hadn't experienced during any of the previous elaborate presentations: genuine curiosity about learning more about her character and thoughts. In a gathering specifically designed to showcase each woman's most attractive qualities, she had instead chosen to reveal her authentic self, and that authenticity had accomplished what all the paint and performance could not. Chapter 4. The Heart Recognizes Truth. The final day of the great gathering arrived with an unseasonable coolness that seemed to sharpen everyone's awareness that momentous decisions could no longer be postponed. Chief Thunderhorse had spent the previous evening in solitude, walking the riverbank under starlight, and weighing not just which woman to choose, but what that choice would mean for his people's future, his own happiness, and the delicate balance his leadership required. As dawn broke over the enormous encampment, the air vibrated with speculation and final desperate preparations. Word had spread that the chief would announce his decision at sunset, and the tension among the assembled women was almost tangible. Some had already begun packing their belongings with resignation, sensing that their elaborate efforts had failed to capture his attention. Others made frantic last-minute attempts to distinguish themselves, sending gifts and messages through intermediaries. Margaret O'Brien spent the morning exactly as she had every other day since arriving, quietly tending to her modest camp, writing a letter to her sister back in Kansas, and observing the controlled chaos around her with the calm detachment of someone who had made peace with uncertainty. She had presented herself honestly, and could do nothing more than accept whatever decision came. "You're remarkably composed for someone who might become a chief's wife today," observed Anna Kowalski, a Polish immigrant woman who had become one of the few to seek out Maggie's company during the gathering, finding her peaceful presence a welcome relief from the competitive frenzy that consumed most participants. "Or might not become anyone's wife," Maggie replied with a slight smile, continuing to fold her few belongings with careful precision. "I learned long ago that you cannot control other people's decisions, Anna. You can only control how honestly you present yourself and how gracefully you accept the results." Meanwhile, Chief Thunderhorse met with his full council for the final time before making his momentous announcement. The political implications of his choice weighed heavily on everyone present, with different tribal factions advocating for different types of selection based on their own vision of the Comanche future. "Choose the banker's daughter from Philadelphia," urged Soaring Eagle, one of the more progressive council members who believed adaptation was essential for tribal survival. "Her family's wealth and connections could bring prosperity and protection that our people desperately need." "The frontier women understand hardship and sacrifice better," countered Gray Buffalo, an elder who worried about losing traditional values. "Someone like the rancher's daughter from Colorado would adapt more easily to our way of life without trying to change us." "And what of the chief's own heart?" asked Running Wolf quietly, voicing the question others hesitated to raise. "Should not his personal happiness be considered alongside political advantages and cultural preservation?" Thunderhorse had been wrestling with exactly that balance throughout the entire process. His position as chief required him to always consider his people's welfare first, but he was also a man seeking a life companion who could share both the burdens and joys of leadership. The elaborate presentations and competitive displays had left him feeling more isolated than before, surrounded by people who seemed to see him as a symbol of status rather than as an individual person. "I have made my decision," he announced finally, his voice carrying the authority that had guided his people through numerous crises. "But first, I want to meet privately with the 3 women who have most impressed me with their character and wisdom. Running Wolf, please ask Margaret O'Brien, Sarah Henderson, and Victoria Ashworth to join me for individual conversations this afternoon." The news that Maggie had been selected as one of only 3 finalists sent shockwaves through the camp and provoked intense speculation about the chief's criteria for selection. Many women who had dismissed her as naive or hopelessly outclassed suddenly looked at her with new interest and grudging respect, trying to understand what the legendary leader had recognized in someone so seemingly unremarkable. "I simply don't understand it," muttered Elizabeth Hartford, unconsciously touching her own elaborate face paint and costly costume. "What could he possibly see in her? She hasn't even tried to make herself attractive or demonstrate any special abilities." But Maggie's selection made perfect sense to those few who had taken the time to really observe her throughout the gathering. While others had focused obsessively on external presentations and competitive positioning, she had consistently demonstrated the kind of steady character and authentic presence that suggested she would be a reliable partner through whatever challenges leadership might bring. The individual meetings took place in a traditional lodge that had been erected specifically for private conversations away from the crowd's curious eyes. Sarah Henderson, the accomplished rancher's daughter, spoke eloquently about her love of horses and her extensive experience managing large-scale cattle operations. Victoria Ashworth, the wealthy merchant's daughter, emphasized her excellent education and her family's ability to provide significant political and financial advantages. When Maggie's turn finally came, she entered the lodge with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout the entire extraordinary gathering. Chief Thunderhorse studied her carefully, noting once again how her unpainted face allowed her natural expressions and emotions to show clearly without artificial enhancement. "Margaret O'Brien," he said in English, which he spoke with greater fluency than most people realized, "you have surprised many people by remaining completely yourself, while others attempt to become what they believe I want. Tell me honestly, what do you think I truly want in a wife?" Maggie considered the question with the same serious attention she gave to all important matters before responding thoughtfully. "I think you want what most people want in a marriage partner. Someone who will stand beside you during the most difficult times, who will tell you the honest truth even when it's hard to hear, and who will work with you to build something larger and more meaningful than either person could create alone. The specific details of what that partnership looks like probably matter less than whether two people are genuinely committed to making it work. And are you prepared to commit to such a partnership with someone you barely know? I'm committed to trying earnestly to build one if you believe we're compatible enough to make the attempt worthwhile. I won't pretend to love you. We don't know each other well enough for that kind of deep feeling yet, but I can promise to approach our marriage with complete honesty, mutual respect, and the sincere intention of making it successful for both of us." Her straightforward answer impressed Thunderhorse more than all the passionate declarations of instant love and romantic devotion he had heard from other women throughout the week. Here was someone who understood that lasting marriages were built on much more solid foundations than romantic feelings, someone who approached the prospect of partnership with mature realism rather than fantasy. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the entire camp gathered for the chief's long-awaited announcement. The three finalists sat in places of honor before the assembled crowd, each woman maintaining careful composure despite the enormous personal stakes involved. The gathering of women, tribal members, soldiers, traders, and curious spectators created an atmosphere of barely contained anticipation that seemed to charge the very air. Chief Thunderhorse stood before the vast assembly with the dignified bearing of a man who had made a difficult decision and found complete peace with his choice. When he spoke, his strong voice carried clearly across the absolutely silent crowd, reaching every corner of the enormous gathering. 5 days ago, I announced my intention to choose a wife from among the courageous women who answered my call. I have been deeply honored by the bravery and determination of every woman who made this remarkable journey. Each of you deserves happiness, respect, and security, and I sincerely wish those blessings for all of you." He paused deliberately, his dark eyes moving across the sea of painted faces and elaborate costumes before settling with unmistakable certainty on the one woman who had remained unadorned and authentic throughout the entire extraordinary week. "I have chosen to ask Margaret O'Brien of Kansas to become my wife, if she will honor me by accepting." The announcement struck the crowd like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. Gasps echoed across the massive gathering, followed by stunned silence as 2,000 women absorbed the stunning reality that the chief had chosen the one woman who had made absolutely no effort to transform herself for his approval or compete with the elaborate displays surrounding her. Maggie herself seemed momentarily overwhelmed, her blue eyes wide with surprise despite her earlier composure and realistic expectations. She had hoped, but hadn't dared to truly expect such an outcome from this unprecedented gathering. "Margaret O'Brien," Thunderhorse continued, approaching her with the formal courtesy his position demanded, "will you accept my proposal of marriage and partnership?" Maggie stood slowly, her simple grey dress making her seem almost luminous in the gathering twilight. For a moment, that felt like an eternity to every watching person, she studied the man before her. Weathered hands that spoke of honest work and genuine leadership, eyes that held both unmistakable strength and surprising kindness, a face marked by the responsibility of guiding others through impossible transitions. "Chief Thunderhorse," she said quietly, her clear voice somehow carrying to every corner of the vast silent gathering, "I accept your proposal with deep gratitude for your trust and complete commitment to building a true and lasting partnership together." As the crowd erupted in a complex mixture of applause, bitter disappointment, and awed amazement, Margaret O'Brien, the woman who had dared to remain authentically herself among 2,000 competitors, stepped forward to begin a new chapter that would challenge and ultimately transform everything. Both cultures thought they understood about love, marriage, and the courage required to bridge two completely different worlds. Chapter 5. The Union That Changed Two Worlds. Final chapter. 4 years had passed since the legendary gathering at Red River, and the spring of 1880 found Margaret Thunderhorse standing in the doorway of the remarkable home she and her husband had created together, a dwelling that perfectly embodied their successful fusion of two distinct cultures. The structure combined the solid log construction favored by frontier settlers with traditional Comanche design elements, including a large central room for community gatherings and carefully positioned openings that honored the sacred directions revered by her adopted people. Margaret, now 33, had grown into her role as the chief's wife with the same quiet determination that had distinguished her during the selection process. Her dark hair, now streaked with premature silver from the responsibilities of leadership, was arranged in traditional Comanche braids, but adorned with a simple Irish cladder ring that had belonged to her grandmother. She wore a dress of her own design, practical blue wool cut in frontier fashion, but decorated with intricate beadwork that told the story of her acceptance into the tribe and her journey from widow to leader. "Mother Margaret," called 12-year-old Swift Deer, running toward the house with a message clutched in his small fist. The boy was one of 4 orphaned children that Margaret and Thunderhorse had welcomed into their family, creating a household that reflected their commitment to building bridges between cultures rather than walls. "Father says the delegation from the Indian Bureau will arrive soon, and you should prepare for the welcoming ceremony." Margaret smiled at the child who had learned to navigate effortlessly between English and Comanche, between Christian prayers and tribal ceremonies, between the competing expectations of two worlds that were slowly learning to coexist. "Tell your father, I'll be ready within the hour. And Swift Deer, remember to show our guests the respect due to people who have traveled far to learn from us." The delegation's visit represented the culmination of 4 years of patient diplomacy and innovative leadership that had established Thunderhorse's territory as a model for peaceful coexistence between Native Americans and white settlers. Unlike other regions where tensions remained dangerously high and violence erupted regularly, the area under Thunderhorse's guidance had become renowned for prosperity, cooperation, and creative solutions to seemingly impossible cultural conflicts. Much of this remarkable success could be attributed to Margaret's unique position as a cultural bridge and skilled mediator. Her role as a white woman who had genuinely embraced Comanche society rather than attempting to change it gave her unprecedented credibility with both communities. She had mastered the language, customs, and spiritual practices of her adopted people while maintaining her own identity and connections to the broader frontier society. "Mrs. Thunderhorse," called Elena Rodriguez, approaching the house with the confident stride of established friendship. Elena was one of several women from the original gathering who had remained in the area after the selection, finding their own paths to happiness and fulfillment, rather than returning home in defeat or disappointment. "The Women's Council meeting is tomorrow afternoon, and we still need to finalize the plans for the new trading post expansion." The trading post represented one of Margaret's most successful innovations, a commercial enterprise where both native and white merchants could conduct business on equal terms, sharing profits and building economic relationships that benefited entire communities, rather than creating winners and losers based on cultural background. "I'll be there," Margaret assured her friend. "Have you received any word from the territorial governor about the land rights legislation we proposed?" "Very encouraging news, actually. Your husband's reputation in Washington has opened doors that seemed permanently closed just a few years ago. Several congressmen are using our model as an example of what's possible when leaders focus on practical cooperation rather than ideological conflict. Indeed, Chief Thunderhorse had become something of a phenomenon in government circles, a Native American leader who had successfully guided his people through the traumatic transition to reservation life while maintaining cultural integrity and achieving genuine economic prosperity. His marriage to Margaret had initially raised suspicions among officials who worried about a white woman gaining influence in tribal affairs, but her obvious dedication to her adopted community and her practical contributions to regional stability had gradually won widespread respect and admiration. As the afternoon progressed, the delegation from the Bureau of Indian Affairs arrived in an impressive convoy of carriages and wagons. Margaret stood beside her husband to greet the officials, her presence serving as a living symbol of the cultural cooperation they had worked so hard to achieve. Commissioner John Wesley Powell, a respected explorer and scientist, emerged from the lead carriage with the bearing of a man expecting to witness something genuinely remarkable. "Chief Thunderhorse, Mrs. Thunderhorse," the commissioner said with formal courtesy that couldn't quite hide his obvious curiosity. "We've received extraordinary reports about your community's achievements. The President himself has expressed interest in understanding how your approach might be adapted for implementation in other troubled regions." The comprehensive tour that followed showcased 4 years of careful development and creative innovation. The reservation featured thriving farms that combined traditional native agricultural wisdom with modern farming techniques, a bustling trading center that served customers from both cultures, educational facilities where children learned from both traditions, and social institutions that served the entire regional community, regardless of cultural background. "Remarkable," murmured Dr. Sarah Hopkins, the delegation's education specialist, as they visited the integrated school where Comanche children learned, alongside the sons and daughters of local ranchers, farmers, and merchants. "I've never witnessed such successful cultural integration anywhere in the country. How did you overcome the resistance and suspicion that has undermined similar efforts throughout the West?" "By beginning with genuine respect, rather than assumptions about superiority," Margaret replied thoughtfully, watching her own adopted children play peacefully with classmates from various backgrounds. Too many integration efforts start with the premise that one culture must abandon its identity to accommodate the other. We began with the conviction that both cultures possessed valuable wisdom and that our children would be stronger and wiser for learning from multiple traditions. The evening feast provided opportunities for more relaxed conversation, as delegation members mingled freely with tribal leaders, local settlers, and the remarkable extended family that Margaret and Thunderhorse had created over their years together. Their household included not only adopted children from various backgrounds, but also elderly tribal members who served as cultural teachers and young people from both communities who came to learn practical skills for navigating an increasingly complex world. "Mrs. Thunderhorse," Commissioner Powell inquired during the meal, "I must ask a personal question that many in Washington have wondered about. Do you ever regret your decision to leave your former life behind? Surely there are aspects of white society and your previous existence that you must miss." Margaret considered the question while watching her husband translate a humorous story between a Comanche elder and a visiting cattle rancher, both men laughing heartily at the cultural misunderstanding that had become a source of shared amusement rather than division or conflict. "Commissioner, I believe you're asking the wrong question," she replied with the same directness that had characterized her from their first meeting. "I didn't abandon my former life. I expanded it beyond anything I could have imagined. I'm still the same person who traveled here from Kansas as a desperate widow, but I've become far more than I ever could have been if I'd remained confined to a single cultural perspective." "And your husband? Has he made similar adaptations to accommodate your background?" Margaret glanced at Thunderhorse, who was now demonstrating proper ceremonial pipe etiquette to one of the younger officials while explaining the spiritual significance behind each gesture. "We've both changed and grown, Commissioner, but we've done it together as partners. That's what genuine partnership means. Evolving in ways that make you stronger as individuals while building something larger and more meaningful than either person could create alone." As the evening progressed, the delegation members found themselves drawn into conversations and activities that systematically dismantled their preconceptions about reservation life and cross-cultural relationships. By the time they retired for the night, several officials were already drafting reports about how elements of the Thunderhorse model might be carefully adapted for implementation in other challenging regions. Later, as Margaret and Thunderhorse walked alone under the vast Texas sky brilliant with stars, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment of recognition and respect. The woman who had sat quietly beside her wagon 4 years ago, expecting nothing and hoping for little, had discovered that sometimes the greatest adventures came from simply being courageous enough to remain authentic in a world that constantly pressured people to become something else. "Do you think they truly understand what we've accomplished here?" Thunderhorse asked, gesturing toward the guest quarters where the delegation members slept, their minds undoubtedly processing everything they had witnessed. "They understand that our approach works effectively," Margaret replied thoughtfully. "Whether they understand why it works so well, that might take considerably longer. Genuine change happens slowly, especially when it challenges people's fundamental assumptions about how different groups should relate to each other. And are you satisfied with gradual change rather than dramatic transformation?" Margaret smiled, taking her husband's strong hand as they continued their peaceful walk. "I've learned to value lasting change over spectacular change. What we've built here will survive and influence others long after we're gone, because it's based on authentic respect and mutual benefit rather than political expediency or temporary advantage." As a shooting star blazed across the Texas sky, Margaret Thunderhorse, the woman who had dared to remain herself among 2,000 desperate competitors, stood as living proof that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to pretend to be something you're not, and finding a partner wise enough to value authenticity over performance. The story that had begun with an unprecedented announcement and shocked the frontier with its unexpected conclusion had evolved into something simpler and more profound, a practical demonstration that genuine partnership, built on mutual respect and shared commitment to something larger than individual desires, could overcome even the deepest cultural divisions and create lasting positive change. Their remarkable union would be remembered for generations, not as a tale of exotic romance between different worlds, but as a powerful example of what became possible when two people chose to build bridges instead of walls, to seek understanding instead of dominance, and to create a future worthy of the trust their communities had placed in their unlikely but ultimately transformative partnership.